Hi, this is Teresa here from Blind Spots again, and today we're going to look at the war in Russia and Ukraine, the war between Russia and Ukraine, I should say. When we talk about Russia as a military power today, what are we actually talking about? Well, we're talking about a state that's still one of the most powerful and serious military powers on earth, and that matters because it's too easy to fall into oversimplified characterizations, either talking about Russia like it's some unstoppable war machine, or talking about it like Ukraine has exposed it as militarily weak and incompetent. Neither is true. Russia remains a top-tier military power for three main reasons: its nuclear arsenal, its sheer scale, and its ability to sustain war production. Russia is still a full-spectrum military state. Nuclear forces, long-range missiles, aerospace forces, air defense, cyber electronic warfare, a navy, space assets, and a huge land warfare tradition. Most countries don't have that. Russia remains, alongside the United States, of course, one of the two largest nuclear powers in the world. And that matters. That alone means it cannot be treated like some wayward secondary level nation. On top of that, Russia has been pouring staggering amounts into its defense. Russia is not just a country fighting a war in Ukraine, it's a country reorganizing itself around long-term military power. Munitions, missiles, drones, refurbished armor, recruitment incentives, industrial output, which is very important to war efforts. The whole system seems to be being bent toward war. All that to say, Russia is still a major military power with global strategic relevance, massive coercive capacity, and a very serious threat profile, especially to nearby states. But it is not the slick, clean, modern force it often projects itself to be. Now, what about Ukraine? Ukraine is not best understood as some old post-Soviet military regime struggling to survive. No. Ukraine has evolved into something else, a hybrid wartime force built around adaptation, drone warfare, resilient command structures, national mobilization, Western supplied system, and a remarkably fast domestic defense tech ecosystem. All of those are reasons why Russia's potential goal of maybe effecting a quick win in Ukraine, if that was its goal at all, has not played out. Ukraine, you could say, has become one of the most battle-adapted militaries in Europe because it has had to innovate under pressure, at speed, with high stakes, its own survival. Ukraine's wartime strengths are very clear. Adaptation is key. Ukraine has learned fast. And its advantage has been that it has been able to learn faster than larger and more bureaucratic established militaries. Second, drones. This is probably Ukraine's most distinctive and disruptive battlefield advantage. Then it has a resilient air defense, without which Russia's strike campaign would have been vastly more destructive. Morale and political cohesion. Ukraine is fighting an existential war that generates a kind of national military energy that neat spreadsheets don't fully capture. You could say that Ukraine, it would be an accurate assessment to say that Ukraine is highly capable, tactically and operationally, extremely innovative and remarkably resilient in defense. But it remains structurally constrained by manpower, industrial depth, and long-term ability to sustain. If we compare the two directly because they are at war, who is actually stronger? In absolute terms, there's no question about the answer. Russia is. That's just the reality of the situation. Russia has bigger strategic arsenal, bigger budget, larger population, more missiles, greater industrial depth, and more capacity to sustain a long war. But Ukraine is stronger relative to its size and resources in adaptation, defensive resilience, drone innovation, and battlefield learning. So the real contrast is not good army versus bad army, or better army versus worse army when you compare Russia with Ukraine in the frame of the war. It's more like Russia is the heavier force and Ukraine is the sharper one. That is one of the reasons, but not the only one, that the war has gone on for so long. Then you could ask the question, given that situation about the military strengths, if Russia is military superior, and it is, why hasn't it just thrown more military power at Ukraine and ended the war faster? And an answer could be because destroying a country and controlling a country are not the same thing. And this is where a lot of causal analysis about this topic can hit a wall. People imagine, and people could say, well, if Russia really wanted to end the war, they would have done. It could just throw everything it's got at Ukraine and war be done. But rubble is not victory, and ash is not political control. When it comes to Ukraine, Russia's problem has never been simply, how do we destroy things? It has also had to deal with these questions. How do we force Ukrainian capitulation? How do we hold territory afterwards? How do we suppress resistance? How do we avoid uncontrolled escalation with NATO? How do we preserve our own stockpiles of weapons and our economy? How do we keep the war politically manageable at home? So no, Russia's strategy has not been maximum destruction at any cost. It has been a shifting mix of attempted regime change, coercion, attrition, infrastructure punishment, mobilization, and a political waiting game. Also, let's not forget, Russia has constraints as well. Yes, it has large missile forces, but that does not mean it has infinite missiles, infinite interceptors, or infinite industrial slack with no trade-offs. Moscow would appear to prefer the strategy of politically sustainable grind. Attrition, which is keeping sustained pressure to weaken an enemy on Ukraine, lets it inflict pain while staying directly below NATO, staying out of the threat of a direct NATO-Russia confrontation. And also there's the case that Russia may genuinely believe that it has time on its side. If the Kremlin thinks Ukraine can be weakened slowly and Western political backing will eventually erode, then a patient grind makes more sense than some all-out gamble for a short-term win or a quick win that wouldn't be quick. So Russia could inflict more destruction, probably, but it cannot guarantee that it would end the war on the terms that it wants. That is a different thing. And what about the question of Ukraine posing a threat to Russia? Before the war, was Ukraine a threat? No. Before the war, pre-2022, Ukraine posed very little direct military threat to Russia, if any. Nor did it have any military designs that we know of on Russia. It was much more of a geopolitical and symbolic problem for the Kremlin than a classic military one. Since the war, and because Ukraine has had to defend itself, Ukraine, in contrast to before the war, now poses a real wartime threat to Russian forces. Military assets, naval posture in the Black Sea, some logistic nodes, some energy infrastructure, and certainly to Russia's image of military competence. Ukraine has pushed back the Black Sea fleet, made parts of the western Black Sea much less usable for Russia, and carried out increasingly long-range strikes on tactical targets. So today, Ukraine is a real operational and economic irritant for Russia, and in some areas, more than an irritant. But let's be clear, Ukraine still does not pose a military or existential threat to the Russian state. Not by a long shot. It's not going to conquer Russia. It's not threatening Russia's nuclear deterrent. It's not threatening Russia's survival in any way. And that is why the Kremlin narrative of an urgent defensive war against some looming Ukrainian military danger was always weak on facts. The more plausible Kremlin fear was more about Ukraine is leaving Moscow's orbit. Ukraine is choosing another future. Ukraine is becoming an example. And for authoritarian imperial systems, Examples can feel more dangerous than armies. Armies you can bomb and fight. Examples, however, spread to other states. So if it's not about Russia neutralizing Ukraine as a threat or vice versa, what is this war really about? I don't think it was ever just about Ukraine. Yes, Ukraine is the immediate object, but the deeper drivers are bigger and more expansive than that. This war makes much more sense if you look at it operating on several levels at once. First, there's the post-Cold War order question. Ukraine became the place where Russia chose to challenge the European security order that emerged after the Soviet collapse. Second, as mentioned, there's the political contagion problem. A functioning, sovereign, increasingly Western-linked Ukraine represents an alternative Slavic political future, one not dependent on Moscow's control. That's dangerous to a regime built on hierarchy, empire, and managed obedience. Third, there's the question of NATO, but not in the cartoon version. Not Ukraine was about to invade Russia with NATO tanks. No, that doesn't hold up. The more serious argument is that Moscow did not want and does not want a huge bordering state becoming irreversibly woven into Western military intelligence, political and industrial networks. Then there is a regime legitimacy inside Russia. Wars like this can be used to justify repression, censorship, sacrifice, militarization, increased spending on war efforts, as we mentioned before, and centralized power in the name of historical struggle. There's the question of empire mindset, and that matters a lot. Ukraine is not just strategically important to Russia, it's symbolically important, historically important, psychologically important. In Kremlin thinking, losing Ukraine is not just about losing influence. It's about losing part of the story Russia tells itself, about its history. Geopolitically, what is Ukraine to Russia is also important. That's also important. Ukraine is not just another neighboring state. It's a buffer, it's a corridor, it's a frontier, it's a Black Sea key, a trade route, a strategic hinge, and an imperial identity wound, all mixed up in the same package. At the hard military level, Ukraine affects Russia's strategic depth on its western flank. At the Black Sea level, Ukraine affects naval access, ports, basing, trade, and power projection. At the political level, Ukraine affects whether Russia still gets to behave like an imperial centre with veto power over its former sphere. And at the symbolic level, Ukraine cuts right into the Kremlin's idea of Russian history and civilizational identity, which we sometimes underestimate in general. Russia's not a collapsing joke, and Ukraine is not a helpless victim waiting to be crushed. And this war was never about one border dispute or one clean security concern. This is not a repetition of Crimea. It's not about the West is right and Russia is simply irrational, or big bad Russia invading good little poor Ukraine. It's more complicated than that. It's a collision between a Western order that treated its own expansion as normal, legitimate, and a post-imperial nuclear power that experienced that expansion as diminishment and responded with coercive violence. That does not make both sides equally responsible, but it does mean that the analysis becomes less analytical when it turns into oversimplification and reductive good Ukraine versus bad Russia narratives. This is not a Western.